Welcome back to Be the Trader, everybody. Today, I have a very special guest, someone I've met through Twitter and been following for some time, then saw his own podcast and really enjoyed it. And he's all about the mindset, at least on his show, and something you guys know that I look forward to talking about. It's something I always talk about. And I wanted to bring in Stephen Goldstein, who is previously a trader in the past and now is a trading coach and mentor to others. And so, Stephen, welcome to the show, my man.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
For sure, for sure. So if you could kind of start off by giving us a little lay of the land, let us know, what got you into the whole world of stock market.
Okay, so I started, many years ago now, 1980. I got a job in the city of London, working for a Japanese bank in the mid-80s, with the ambition of being a trader. Everything was just opening up then. It was a new world. Everyone I know was going into the city to find a job as a trader. None of us really knew what it was. It was buying, it was selling, and we tried to get jobs as soon as we could. We obviously in those days it was all about penny stocks and stocks. But I landed a job on the rates desk, the rates and FX desk of a Japanese bank, and that's the direction I went into as a result of that. I landed my first position as a trader in October 87. So it was a little bit of a baptism by fire, because you can imagine the markets were a little bit insane in October 87. And that was my career, carried on from there. And I was a trader for nearly 25 years. I worked at banks such as Credit Suisse throughout the 90s, both in market making roles and prop trading roles. I then worked at the German bank, Commerzbank, in the late 90s into the early noughties, and then at the banking arm of American Express in a proprietary trading role up till 2009. And then I was at a career crossroads where, the bank American Express sold its banking arm to Standard Chartered, and they really didn't want any of us old dinosaurs sitting in there at that point. It was a young man's game, as it was going algo based electronic, and we were still using abacuses and fingers. So I was a career crossroads, and actually I was looking for a job in a hedge fund because I'd had a lot of consistency in the previous years. I was doing pretty well, and I started talking to a few hedge funds. Somebody who had coached me 10 years earlier planted the seed in my head of becoming a coach, and I couldn't get that seed out my head, and I thought, that's an interesting option. I'll carry on trading and I'll be a coach. Working pretty much more in the sort of holistic, entire process, mindset, everything game, rather than working on strategy or anything like that. So that was the choice I made. I thought I'll trade from home and I'll be a coach. And actually the coaching got busier and I started to enjoy it more. And, it was hard for me to do both because I'm an all-in trader. I'm fully engrossed in it. And, I was sitting there getting on trains to town, facing people in meetings, couldn't see what was going on the phone. Markets were a bit wild in 2011, 2012 with the Greek crisis. And I thought, I can't do this. I can't be a professional trader and professional coach. I decided, peace of mind, I'd go into this path, in the future. And so I gave up the trading. I still trade a little bit, but more as a hobby, bit of fun. Then it's certainly not an income early or profession for me these days.
So when you threw a lot at me. First off, you've been around tenfolds of my time. So that's awesome. I love that you've been around for so long that you've experienced all of these different stages of the market, of different journeys, from a broker to looking at hedge funds to being your own trader to now being a trading coach. I want to get into all that, but what I want to ask you first is mainly when it comes to coaching, now that you're going to focus towards that, give me an idea of what you mean by you're a coach.
Okay, so I work, people come to me and they say, look, I want to work with you, Steve. I need help. I want to improve my performance. I want to improve my process. I think I've got more potential and I'm not realizing it. I'm not hitting the numbers that I think I could, or I'm doing really well, but I want to get better. It's a little bit like, Roger Federer or Djokovic. They have coaches. They always want to be the top of their game. And some of the guys I work with are top of the game. They're big guys in hedge funds. They're investment bank traders. They're in energy trading firms. So, in fact, if I was to say, who do I work with? I probably do about 80% of my stuff with guys who are doing well and want to get stronger. They want to get better. They think I can improve. Having a coach would be handy. And actually, that's worked out for a lot of guys, especially the hedge fund guys, because there's so much pressure on them. And great example of that recently was a guy I've worked with for about 3 years in a hedge fund. He's done really, really well. He joined from an investment bank, asked for a coach. I worked with this particular hedge fund. They gave him to me. And, a lot of guys who join hedge funds don't actually make it. They fall by the wayside. The attrition rate is very high. And he did really well. They doubled the amount of capital he had. He already had 250 million. Because he was doing so well, they increased that to 500 million worth of capital. And I then worked with him to, help him remain on balance, because that's a lot of money you've got to play with, and the swings are huge. And, it all came to fruition earlier this year when, during the COVID crisis, he had the biggest loss he's ever suffered in his life. And then within a week, he's recovered it all, and he's now having his best ever year. And he brought his attention to some of the things we worked on, that we've been working on over these years, that strengthen him, that improve his resilience, that bring him to focus, that get him to that emotional balance, so that he can be at his best when he needs to be. And he said to me, he said, Steve, there's this, I've got a little figure that I gave him. I use lots of tools and tricks. And, he looked at this figure. He's based in Asia. He works in Asia. And he said, this figure you gave me was sitting on my desk the whole time. And I was looking at him, and it just reminded me, and it kept me on a focus. And he said, honestly, I don't know how I did it, but, I made that money back, and I still don't know where it came from, that kind of inner strength. But that's the sort of stuff I do. That's what I work on. I call it the metagame. It's the metagame of trading. That's actually the name of the book I'm writing at the moment. But that's what I focus on. The metagame is the game. Your strategy, your tactics, your method, your system, they're not the things that give you the edge, because they're not unique. You need them, and you need to be strong on them. And, if you have a bad strategy, you're going to fail. Right. Simple as that. You need to have a strong strategy. But alone, they won't be the things that give you continued success. It's your metagame that is the thing that leads to that continued success. So when I work with people, I'm working on their metagame all the time.
And forgive me, are you saying mental or meta? M-E-T-A?
Meta. Sorry, it's my London accent.
No, you're fine. You're
meta.
Fine.
Yeah, I had this with someone last week. He said it's meta. We call it meta. So yeah, M-E-T-A. The game beyond the game.
Oh, okay. Okay. So that's like, is that like, give me that, I guess I'm thinking like the mindset, right? It's
everything. It means different things in different contexts.
Okay.
Like within poker, the meta game is what you play beyond the strategy. You have to know who your opponents are and how they play a little bit, and adapt your game. So your meta game would really be fixed around, everyone knows the strategy and rules. Mm-hmm. So how do you go beyond that to win? Because everyone else knows those. That is the known game. So how can you work outside of the known game? And you have to have a strong meta game.
Gotcha.
So in trading, you don't know who your opponents are. Your opponent is the market. And you can't really beat the market. It's bigger than you. It's stronger than you. It doesn't care about you.
Yeah. And
it's got so many elements to it. You can't know who's against you at any one time. So the meta game comes to knowing yourself. Mm. I have this model which I've developed over the years, and it starts with the idea that we have a gap. We have a gap between what we could make, what our potential is, and what we do make. Mm. And I'll give you a perfect example of this, where we saw this numerically. A few years ago, I worked with this trader at a hedge fund who'd been working there for about 3 years. And he came to me and he said, look, if I'm honest, I'm not doing as well as I thought I should. I'd been at a bank for 12 years before that, an investment bank. The firm had been wanting to poach me for years. I hadn't felt any need originally to go there, but now I was ready for it. And my numbers at the bank were really strong. But when he joined the fund, he was very, again, mediocre average performance, sort of single-digit figures on average each year. And this guy kept meticulous records of every trade that he ever wanted to put on, every idea he had. So I got him to say, look, you've got a 3-year record. Go back, look at it, and play around with as if you'd put every single idea on in the way you wanted to execute it. What would your P&L have been? And that effectively was his potential. So if he'd have done everything he said he was going to do in the way he was going to do it, that was his potential performance. And actually, he would have averaged about 40% return over those 3 years per annum. And that's on a lot of money in a hedge fund. And he would have done that with a really strong Sharpe ratio as well. So, sort of not particularly large volatility in his P&L. But his actual performance, as we said, was averaging somewhere between 4 to 6% on annum. And with not particularly, with a not particularly good Sharpe ratio. And he said, look, I'm holding on here. I've been here 3 years. I'm not going to last a 4th year if my numbers come in at that sort of level again. So that was a perfect example of the behavioural gap. The difference between where he was and what he could achieve was it was here, it was in his mind, it was in his head. It was behavioural. And the metagame was him. How can he improve that? How can he close that gap?
And I would say, like, if anything, I can easily relate to what you're saying, and let me know if I'm on the right track here. I'm like, for me, I know what I can potentially make on every trade, right? Your strategy. Strategy is something that's common. Like at the end of the day, we are all trading pretty much the same, quote unquote, like similar way, but we're just trading them a little bit different because based on how we are in the moment, what we're feeling and so forth. And what I've noticed is like, clear-cut example. I mean, I've had days where everything works perfectly, right? And you trade it well, and you hit it just like you say you want to, and you exit just like you say you want to, and that's your potential. You hit your potential. And then there's those days where you don't hit your potential, where maybe everything is the same as previously, but maybe you were a little off today, and you were, and off your mental game, not really sticking to a certain like rule that you had for yourself and broke something. Is that what, like, when that happens, I'm sure it's happened, like you said before, when you're coaching people, and that happened, that one gentleman who took a big loss, when those things happen, what is the first thing that you suggest for people to do whenever it's like they know what they're doing, right? Because you deal with people who usually know what they're doing, they have success, but they have that once in a life, like once in a while, you'll get a little lapse, like not something dramatic, but something where you're like, man, I knew I should have done that. Any suggestions, or is that just part of the game? Like, that's just going to happen?
Yeah, it's part of the game. I mean, this guy did nothing wrong with his process when he dropped all that money because, he's a risk taker. He has a long-term view on the market. That long-term view is based off a narrative he forms from everything that's happening. And then COVID comes along. It's an outlier. It's, you could say maybe it was predictable unless, if you understand pandemics, if you'd experienced another pandemic, but he wasn't around in the Spanish flu in 1918. So, it was a unique situation. Now, whatever we do, whenever we take risks, a lot of them are going to be wrong. When I was a trader, I reckon 1 in 5 of my trades used to work out, which meant that I was break even or losing on the other ones. And I accepted that. That was my strategy. And I'm not going to beat myself up if I lose money, because my method or system would identify a trade, I'd put it on, it wouldn't work out. That was within the rules, and I allowed for those. But it was the ones where I allowed that to screw in my mind. And then I'd start changing my behaviors. So if you lose money, you can still be trading well, because, it's sometimes I would come out and go, boy, I should have actually lost a lot of money that day. I was completely wrong going into it. And yet I wasn't too bad, and it felt like a win.
Right.
That kind of in the zone moment. On another day, you come in and you've got all the setup you want. The market's going your way, and you sit there with a flat day, and you're like, Jesus, I was completely on tilt, right?
Yes.
All day long. And that is, and that's when you get into that mindset where you cannot buy a winning trade, So that's where you don't want to be, but you can't always help yourself. It's the nature of this game. It's impossible to put yourself in one place. It's impossible to put yourself in the other place, but you can get yourself into states and ways of being and have a philosophy and a practice that makes sure your mindset is geared towards the right end of that. But you also have to work on your process. A lot of people, their process is wrong. And I'm not talking about strategy here. I'm talking about risk process. They don't look into their risk process. They don't really understand it, or they're good at part of it, but not good at another part. And they don't work on the part they're not good at. So one of the big things for me that when I came out of the coaching all those years, 20 years ago, I had a coach in the year 2000 that was, that was pivotal for me in my career. I came out of that and I realized, do you know what? My gap comes from, I am really good at finding value. I'm really good at, I get the market and I'm good at analysis. I should have been an analyst. That's what I should have been. But as a risk taker, I was really poor. I was mediocre. I was good enough to get through to that point, but I wasn't good enough to thrive. I had some years which were great, but you can't live on one great year or two great years.
Right.
You have to have consistently good years, the odd bad year, the odd amazing year, and that's the sort of model you want. And a lot of traders who are new fall by the wayside because, if they have a good start, they just assume it's always going to go like that.
Yeah.
Or they assume their system is going to last forever when it doesn't. They may have stumbled upon a system that was good at that moment, good at that point in time. It's particularly good maybe for this market. If you've got a system that's just buying stocks, you generally had a pretty good few years, but the markets don't change that way. So you have to have a strong metagame, which can actually make you good in a bull market, good in a bear market. I got guys who are good in ranging markets and good in directional markets. They can play momentum, they can play value when they can adjust. These are some of the greats I'm talking about who just seem to be able to readjust very quickly to what the situation is.
So let me ask you, you mentioned earlier there's a little figure you give some of your guys. Can you explain what that is and why?
As part of my coaching, I use lots of different techniques. So I want people to be able to kind of see themselves from afar. It's almost like, imagine you had a video of you, I don't know, let's say you were a pitcher in baseball, and you have a close-up video of every game and you run through it with a coach and you can see your hand movements, you can see, what you're doing in the game, and you can start zooming in. Now, you can't do that in trading. I mean, the closest you get is a journal. But I then like to play with people a little bit and say, let's imagine you're watching yourself. So I do lots of, imagine you were watching yourself trading over various periods. And I have lots of exercises I do. So I might do an empty chair. Let's imagine you're watching yourself in that chair trading, and, what's your body posture like? What are you seeing when you're under pressure? When you did that bad trade or you did that good trade. Let's look at what you're seeing. And I use figurines as well, to create a scenario on a tabletop. Who's in the trade room with you? Who's your opponent? Who's your inspiration? Let's, this figure here, who's messing with your head? A lot of the time there's people messing with your head. Who's that figure represent? Well, that represents social media. Who on social media? These guys are always winning. Okay, you do know they don't exist, right?
Right.
Okay, yeah, I know, but they exist in my mind. That's the problem. So that figure can represent that, right? Let's just move him out of the way. There's good things about social media as well. You're getting your information, you're getting your data. You don't have to listen to that guy who says sell here. He's not making. It doesn't really exist. So we use all these different tools
Yeah.
as part of my coaching training. I've had a lot of coaching training over the years in different methods, techniques, models. From some of it's evolved from psychotherapy.
So I like that, by the way. I like that a lot. Like visualizing yourself trade during that moment. What were you thinking? What is your body language? What are you thinking in that moment? How are you breathing and so forth? And
Yeah.
one thing that I do, because you mentioned the picture, is I record my screen. And when
Oh, really?
when I'm trading, I record my screen and I have this mic here and I actually talk out loud like what I'm thinking. And then I
It's brilliant.
rewatch, and when I lose, like today I had a rough day. And so what I did was went back and watched it, and I can hear what I was thinking in that moment, and I was even saying things like I shouldn't be doing this. So it's just like, but when you hear it from a different perspective, you kind of are like, you can pick up cues that happen before the incident happens, and then you can be
Yeah.
like, oh, when I do these things, it's probably I should not, you start to pick up the domino effect or whatever. You get to remove certain dominoes so they don't all tip over. And that's something that has helped me. So you made me think about that, because I agree with you 100%. So I'm glad I asked you about that figurine, because it's a good other tool that you could use for that. I'm
Yeah.
curious, because it seems like you focus on traders who are mainly, managing, millions of dollars, right? Whereas a lot of the traders that I talk to on a daily basis are just retail day traders, right? I'm curious if you do talk to any retail or big retail day traders, and if you do, and if you don't, that's fine. But is there a big difference in terms of the meta game, since what we're talking about, to be a successful trader,
Yeah.
in a hedge fund and a retail, or is it pretty much the
Yeah.
same?
Yeah, I do work with a lot of retail and
Oh,
private
okay.
traders, and I mean, I've actually got, Jack Schwager's got a new book, the new Market Wizards book
Yep.
coming out. Three guys I've coached are in that,
Oh, okay.
so you'll be able to see that, and they're all private traders. They do work in a prop trading shop here in London, um, but they all, it's their own money they're working with. They're exceptional individuals, and I've worked with them, for a few years. And yeah, the game is. I mean, first of all, you eat what you kill. It's a big difference. The hedge fund guy, the investment bank guy, the energy firm guy, he gets paid a salary at the end of the day. And I actually find that, I think a lot of private traders are a lot better than a lot of the hedge fund traders.
Hmm.
But it is a very different game. They've come through investment banks. They've usually been market makers in some way, or they've run a portfolio of investments, or they've come through from the analysis side.
Hmm.
So it's a different path, a different journey. It's very hard for a private trader to make it into a hedge fund because of the different environment, the different expectations. And I do coach one guy at a hedge fund who was a private trader to start with. So, and I have explored getting a couple of guys into some hedge funds, but it's a little bit like the selection process happens from, oh yeah, I work with that guy at JP Morgan or Morgan Stanley, and I know him and I trust him, and let's get him in. And then, who's this guy? He's just got a spreadsheet. They don't really understand the private
Yeah.
traders, but I know the track records and P&L of these private traders, and some of them are making more money than the hedge fund guys,
And
for themselves.
yeah, no, I believe that. Now I was curious on what have you seen that separates these big time traders, right? Because we read Market Wizards, and we definitely read those as great books. But like, what, just from your perspective and coaching these bigger time traders, like who manage a lot of money, or the retail big traders who are making ton, what have you seen is different in terms of this guy over here, and then these new guys who are like trying to get their way up? And do you notice anything?
Yeah, well, it's there's a lot of things that are similar. It's kind of, let's look at what the great things they do are.
Sure.
Now, I've got one thing which stands out for me, that all traders, whether they're retail guys or whether they're um, big guys in funds, I've noticed this. There's a few things. One of them I call the ability to let go. Now, that is what I call the super skill of great trading. Okay,
I
it's
like it.
just that ability to put a line under whatever happened and move on. And it sounds easy. It's an incredibly hard thing to do. You know, it's it is a super skill. You know, I coached this guy years ago, and I talk about him all the time. So if you've heard my podcasts, you've probably heard me mention him, and I'll be mentioning him in a book. But I don't tell people who he is. I worked with him at a US investment bank in the early 2010s, and he's now at a hedge fund. But he was even though he was a trader in a bank, he was also a world top 200 poker player at the time. And there's a lot of similarities between the mindset of poker and the mindset of trading. And I asked him, I said, you know, you play every week. He goes over every week to Macau and takes part in tournaments there. So I said, and he compared trading all the time to poker. It was always, it was almost the same thing for him. And I said, what is it that makes you better than the other guys you play poker with, that gets you up there? And this was a kind of description of the metagame in a sense. He said, well, look, we all know the same value of the hands. We all know how the game is played. We all know the rules. We all know what you go in and what you don't go in.
Yep.
You know, we all know that seating can have an advantage sometimes.
Yep.
In that, you know, we know all of that. There's nothing new under the sun in those things. He said, but I'll tell you what I do. I walk away better than anyone else. And I said to him, what does that mean? And what he was really describing was, you know, he said, well, I walk away from a hand better than anyone else. I walk away from the table. You know, I walk away from a bad situation. I walk away from a good outcome. You know, I let go of that. You know, I don't let that mess with my mind. You know, don't let that mess with it doesn't put me on. I get out of tilt much quicker than other people. You know, he wasn't immune to going on tilt.
Right.
Sometimes it would really mess him up. But generally, over many months and many years, he was better at walking away, which was really him saying, I'm better at letting go than anyone else. You know, I can come back to the table the next day or the next week, and it's like, whatever happened last week, whether it was a good outcome or a bad outcome, it's irrelevant. And this clear head, clear mindset, focused on what I need to do in front of me. And he said, you won't believe how many people cannot do that. And he said, it means that on average, their pots are going to be my pots by the end of the night. And my pot on a bad night is not going to be their pot, because I can walk away and just, you know, my ego, this guy almost had no ego. He was so humble. He had so much humility, which again are all parts of this trading journey. He had an ego. Everyone's got an ego, and it's right. What motivates you. You can't, you know, it's what gets you out of bed in the morning and drives you to take risks. So to say he didn't have one, but he knew how to balance it. And that to me was, and he ended up working in a hedge fund. He still is, and he's a great trader there. I see the same thing with great private traders. And the most successful private trader I know has actually been headhunted by every single hedge fund, and he won't go there. He said, why do I need investors? Why do I need people restricting me? You know, see, the hedge fund, you have rules, you have mandates you've got to adhere to. And you have size that, you know, sometimes you have to be in the game. Whereas a private trader, you can choose, I don't like this market, I'm not going to play. Mm-hmm. You know, it's your choice. I can walk away for it. You know, you can really do it in hedge funds, but most people feel under pressure to be in there the whole time.
Yep.
So actually there's an advantage sometimes from being a private trader. And some of the private traders I know have made a lot of money. Have got no interest in trading other people's money.
And I think what you said there is just the ability to walk away, the ability to like, I think it also lines up with forgiving yourself, right? Like whenever you make a mistake, forgiving yourself and moving forward. Like that's so hard to do, but it seems so easy. Like you said, when someone says like, oh, I can walk away, but when you're in that moment and you just took a loss, why are you still like, you know, trying to jump right back in, you know, like
self-compassion. It's vital. And to be able to do that, and there's a great story in it's a new Market Wizards book, which comes out in November, but it's one of the guys who I coach tells it that, you know, there's a day when he dropped £1 million. You know, what's that, about $1.3 million. And he went out and Jack Schrager asked him what he did that night. And he said, I went out and celebrated. It was his worst night ever. Why did you do that? What, celebrate what?
Oh, you dropped. I thought you meant like he won. Okay.
No, he lost. He dropped.
Okay, gotcha.
Sorry, London accent again. So he went out and he celebrated. And he said, why? He said, because, if I celebrate that, I know that I'll come in tomorrow with a clear head. I'm not going to sit there, beat myself up, moan about it. Shit happens. That's the name of the game we're in. I can come in tomorrow with a completely clear head, start again. And he'd made that his attitude. He'd made that part of who he was. And this guy was a phenomenal trader. You'll read about him. I don't want to sort of mention any names yet. And it's really interesting because, you asked about what private traders do. I think they do this a lot more than hedge fund traders. Okay. What you described about keeping a record of what you're doing in the day and speaking into the microphone, that sort of thing. I find private traders do this self-reflection and this kind of keeping a record of their performance and tallying it a lot more than the hedge fund traders. Because, as I say, you eat what you kill. If you don't make money, no one's going to pay you. And if you lose money, it's your own money. Yeah. So you've got to work so hard. So there's this kind of new professionalism, which I see in the younger guys, the private traders. With some of the guys who've been on our podcast who are great private traders that we've had. And I've got so much, I've got a newfound respect for the retail traders. It is so hard to succeed in that world. The odds are against you.
Yep.
And normally they start off with a small amount of money.
Yep.
So they've got to turn that pretty quickly into an amount of money that can then generate a living and an income. And that's, it's almost like they're fighting impossible odds. And yet they win. And I see it time and time again. Not many of them do, but the ones that do, they do this. They are almost so professional about it. They're almost like athletes of the mind.
Yeah, they really are. I agree. And you mentioned earlier the guy who took a loss of like 1.3 million, and then he went to celebrate. Like, that was really cool to hear because it's not something that most of us do. We tend to beat ourselves up. And I think what I'm very curious about is, like, what do you think gives him the ability to just do that? Or, I mean, you have to take a lot of losses, right, to get to that point, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, his focus was incredible. He was so driven and motivated to succeed. And you'll hear his story, or you read his story. I mean, he is the most phenomenal trader. I remember telling Jack Schrager about him, and he interviewed him, and he said, this guy may just be the best trader I've ever interviewed. Right. And, he is a mental athlete. His focus.
You're going to have to let me know later.
Yeah. He does whatever is needed to win. And he knows that you have to work on yourself. You have to work on the person behind the trader. That's what you have to do.
Yeah.
That person does the trading, but if that person is screwed up, if that person isn't optimal, he told me one year where he went out on a long stag weekend. Do you call it a stag? You have a bachelor party.
Oh, yeah.
You have a bachelor party.
Yeah.
So it was a week-long bachelor party, and he was drinking a lot of that. And he said he came back and his head was screwed for the next 2 weeks because the alcohol affected his precision. I mean, I used to call him a sniper. He could sit there for weeks and not trade, even though he was a day trader, because he'd wait for that shot.
Yep. And
if he couldn't take that shot and he couldn't get out because, risk is everything. That shot requires, so he might have all these scenarios in his head that he's panned out. But it's so important to him to be able to get out that shot. And actually what happened on that one occasion was it was over an ECB meeting and his computer went down exactly as the ECB minutes came, or the result came out. And he couldn't do anything about it. He was positioned the wrong way around. But he said, I would have made money that day because I know, I'd factored in they could do this, what the market's going to do, how I could turn it around. So he was like, he is, I call him a sniper,
Hmm.
just an incredible individual, but, so focused. And his colleagues, I still work with a couple of them, and again, they're just so motivated, so driven. But they do have screw-ups. They all have screw-ups, and you have to respect that you're going to have those days as well. It's the nature of the game.
And which makes it so hard. That's why that's why it's so hard.
Yeah, and like every sports person is going to, the greatest sports people in the world to do something. You're like, where did they? You're watching it, and you're like, I can't believe he did that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And sport is a great analogy for all this stuff. Sometimes your body just fails at the wrong moment.
Well, let me ask you this, Steve. Before we wrap this up, I would like to find out, first off, if there's other people who have other questions, because you've been given a lot of good information, and I feel like there's more we can get. So if people may have more questions for you, of course, they can find you on your AlphaMind podcast, which is on all platforms. But what's another way that they can reach out to you if they have questions?
Well, they could email me, info@alpharcube.com, or stephen.goldstein@alpharcube.com, but info's a little bit easier. So that's my company, Alpha R Cubed Limited, and the website is alpharcube.com. If they want to drop me a line, I can't promise I can always answer straight away, but I'll set it aside. I'm on Twitter as well, @AlphaMind101. So, if they want to drop me a question on there, I'll try and answer it as best I can.
Perfect.
And again, just tune into the podcast. And I want you on the podcast at some point. It'd be great. I love having, we interview people from all walks of the market, from the experience to the younger than you, just making that journey, analysts, scientists, coaches. We want people from everywhere that illuminate the mental side of that journey and what that challenge is. Because it is so hard.
Oh, yeah, it is. It is definitely hard. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for being here today, my friend. I really, really enjoyed this conversation, and I know a lot of people are going to get a lot of value from this. So I really appreciate you being here today, my man.
It's a pleasure, and well done on this podcast. I love the stuff you do, and so I've listened to a few of them, and they're great. So
thank you.
Good luck with your trading.